Are you a warm weather person, or do you like the colder winter months? See, for me, personally, I like the warm months. I love the sunshine, I love the warm breeze, I love to swim at Lake Michigan near where I live. But I know people who just love the snow. Just love it. They love the extra layers that they get to wear, and they find that time of year just beautiful. I am not one of those people. But whatever your stance is on that time of the year, I think we can all agree that we all have our limits. For example, I love the summer, but I wouldn't exactly want to live near the equator where it's just muggy and hot all the time. On the flip side, I believe that cold weather people will shiver throughout the details of this story. Hello, and welcome back to Life's Strange Occurrences, where we will cover some of the most miraculous and unbelievable stories of survival throughout all history. Our goal is to bring even just a little bit of light and hope into a world that has very little of both. Now, I've said this for all the stories that we've covered, but today's story is just plain remarkable. Today we'll be covering the unbelievable and heartbreaking tale of Sir Douglas Mawson. Now, we want to thank you all for tuning in today, but there are some graphic details in this story that some might find distressing, and that includes harm to both humans and animals. We'll try to describe any subject material in as little detail as possible, but we want to provide as much information as we can so that you, the audience, can understand the weight of each situation. So, we will give a formal disclaimer right now that viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's get into our story. Douglas Mawson was born on May 5th, 1882 to parents Robert Ellis Mawson and Margaret Ann Moore in Shipley near Yorkshire, England. Now, he had a fairly normal couple years of his life, but when he was 2, his parents uprooted him and moved to now what is west of Sydney, Australia, and then later into Glebe, which is also near Sydney. He attended Forest Lodge Public Schools, and then Fort Street Model School, where he would then graduate. After graduating, Douglas would go on to attend the University of Sydney, where he would later graduate with a bachelor's degree in engineering. Now, even though he had an engineering degree, he would enter the field of geology. Douglas would be appointed as a geologist in an expedition to the island that is now known as Vanuatu, which is about 1,200 miles off the coast of Australia. In 1905, Mawson would go on to become a lecturer in petrology and mineralogy at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. Now, even though lecturing worked for Mawson, he'd acquired a taste for adventure on his previous expedition. As such, he set out on another journey, but this time he was headed south. Very south. In fact, where Douglas was headed, it really doesn't get any more south than that. They were headed to Antarctica, and the South Magnetic Pole. However, that wasn't before being the first to climb the summit of Mount Erebus. After turning down an expedition in 1910, Mawson decided to lead his own expedition in 1912. The plan was to set sail across the Southern Ocean, set aground on Antarctica, and transverse and map the most remote regions. Now, this would prove to be one of the worst mistakes Mawson ever made. You see, for Arctic ventures nowadays, we have equipment and gear that can help us in the modern day make these journeys much more easily. However, back in 1912, they weren't very well equipped for a trip like this. For instance, our clothing now is built to repel the snow and keep us dry and warm and insulated. Back then, their clothing wouldn't retain heat as easily, and it would soak in snow and other liquids much more. This increased the probability for hypothermia. Nowadays, we have snowmobiles, we have ORVs, and other various vehicles that can help us transverse those terrains, but back then, all they had was sled dogs. You see where I'm going with this? At this point, it just seemed like a suicide mission. It's been said by a man named Apsley Cherry Garrard, who was on a different mission at the time, that the weather was so cold in Antarctica that his teeth's nerves had been killed and split to pieces. Now, if a veteran explorer said this of the negative 77-degree temperatures, it must be true. But Mawson was no rookie either. So Mawson would set out with 2 others. A man named Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnies, a British Army officer who would act as the dog handler, and a man named Xavier Mertz, who was a 28-year-old Swiss lawyer whose sense of humor would be a welcomed relief on the expedition, and he was also a champion cross-country skier. The 3 would set out from base camp on November 10, 1912, with 3 sleds, supplies, and 16 dogs among the 3 of them. Among the men, they would have over 1,700 pounds of food and specific scientific instruments that they would need to map the regions. As they set out, they were making great time. The dogs were full of energy and ran at tremendous speeds, especially considering the heavy load that they were carrying. By the time that December 13th rolled around, they had already traveled over 300 miles. Now, as amazing as that is, it's just not sustainable. I mean, for a time, they were doing great. They were making great time and the rations were holding up. However, as time went on, they began to burn through the food, dogs would get sick, and overall, things just turned very, very sour and very, very quickly. Now, as I stated before, there are distressing details to this story, so before we continue, we do want to remind you to proceed at your own discretion at this point. Now, there's a couple different odd situations that happened next. First, Mawson had a vision of his father who, when Mawson left, his father was in great health. However, during his time away, his father would become very ill and pass away. Now, the next one, though a common occurrence in extreme temperatures, is pretty disturbing nonetheless. The men who were on the expedition found one of the huskies, who was pregnant at the time, devouring her babies. Now, as I said before, this was common, but the men just felt like it was a bad omen. In addition, at one point, a seabird called a petrel flew directly into the side of one of the sleds and killed it instantly. It was said later in a diary that no one knew where it came from, it just appeared out of nowhere. Now, one thing kept leading to another, and bad luck just kept manifesting around this expedition. At 3 separate points, Ninny's sled almost fell into different crevasses in the glacier. Ninny would develop snow blindness and an abscess on the tip of his finger, which was incredibly painful for him. The pain became too much for Ninny to bear, so Mawson drew his pocket knife and sliced the finger open to drain it. As the weather got worse, Mertz would become concerned about the stability of the glacier below them. Even though the other men slept well, this would keep Mertz awake often at night for longer than was probably healthy for him. He was convinced that at any point the glacier could just give out below them, and who knows how long that drop would be. The following day, on December 14th, 1912, the weather broke. It was surprisingly warm, which helped the men make excellent time. They rode and rode across the glacier. Now, Mawson was tracking the sun at the time to know their positioning, and Mertz was skiing ahead, but suddenly they both just stopped. They looked around, and they saw that Ninny's and his dogs were nowhere to be seen. As they continued to search, the sinking realization dawned on them. You see, as the weather got warmer, the ice weakened and shifted below them. The team had to cross an 11-foot crevasse. Now, Mawson and Mertz had made it safely, but the weight became too much for Ninny's and his sled. Ninny's, his dogs, his sled, and the supplies that he was carrying all fell through the snow and plummeted to the bottom. Mawson and Mertz returned to the edge of the crevasse and noticed a little ledge a good distance down. On it were 2 of the dogs. Now, one of them was deceased, and the other was severely injured. However, there was no sight of Ninny's. After running a few tests, they estimated that the chasm was probably about 150 feet deep, and there's no sign of their teammate. After 5 hours of calling for Ninny's, they just gave up hope that he was alive. The loss was great. How would the 2 remaining men and the dogs even be able to continue at this point? You see, because Mawson believed that his lead sled would encounter most of the difficulties, he ended up loading most of the rations and supplies onto Ninny's sled. Now, all that was gone, and all they had left were their sleeping bags and about enough food to last them a week and a half or so. Then came the dark thoughts. Put yourself in their situation for a second. You're out in the polar wilderness. It's beyond cold and the weather is treacherous even on the warm days. You've lost most of your food and your supplies, but you have a long way to go to get even back to your base. You see, you're left with minimal options, and as such, you start to view things in a different light. You look at anything that could possibly be eaten as a potential dinner, including the animals pulling your sled. Mawson and Mertz would kill the weakest dog and ingest part of it themselves, and then the rest would go to the remaining dogs to help them keep up their strength. For a few days, everything went according to plan. They covered a lot of ground, and they even gained a little bit of hope for survival. However, that was just for a few days. Mawson would become snowblind himself, which would make traveling all that more difficult. Mawson would push through the pain, but Mertz would try to help him out by creating a solution consisting of zinc sulfate and a certain white powder that's not snow. Mertz would apply the solution to Mawson's eyes. Even though I'm sure Mawson was feeling better, they would still be in a blizzard. As they trudged on, they couldn't see anything, even with normal vision. It would become so bad that 2 huskies would collapse, and the men would have to secure themselves to their sled. Now, where this is heartbreaking to read and tell you, it would maybe have been a little bit of a relief for these 2 men because it would have meant more food for them and the remaining dogs. However, with each passing day, the food they ingested became less and less palatable. It wasn't just the dogs whose health was declining, though. Mawson and Mertz themselves would be severely struggling by this point. You see, ingesting anything they could seemed like a good idea at the time. It's believed that all the livers that they would have eaten at the time would have caused something called hypervitaminosis A. In layman's terms, it means that they would have ingested more than 1 million IU of vitamin A daily. When you ingest that much vitamin A, your skin can no longer adhere to your body. So the men's skin literally started coming off in sheets. However, it was either this or starve, so I imagine that was a pretty easy decision for them to make. Hoping that this would fix the situation, they bunkered down for the next 24 hours in their sleeping bags. But things weren't looking good. If they couldn't find a way to travel over 10 miles a day, they wouldn't make it. As they started the next day, Mertz was starting to lose his grip on reality. Many things would happen, but due to the sensitivity of the content, I'm going to choose to leave much of it out. The important details are that Mertz would become hysterical. Mawson would even need to put him in a sleeping bag and hold him down. And sadly, the exposure to the elements would just become too much. Mertz would attain a high fever and he would pass away at 2 a.m. on the morning of the 8th. Now, as difficult as this would be for Mawson, it would mean one thing. He might actually survive. You see, he had more food to himself, and he could travel at the necessary speeds to get back to the base camp, which was over 100 miles away. However, Mawson wasn't in good condition himself. His nose and lip had split from exposure, and he still had the skin condition happening. At this point, he was constantly fighting the overwhelming urge to give in. But he didn't. You see, these are the kind of stories that we want to cover. When all the odds are against our protagonists, they keep going. They don't give up. They decide their fate. For Mawson, every last step he took was agonizing. He kept pushing on, but the pain was almost too much to bear, and he still had many miles to go. So he smeared a fatty substance known as lanolin on his feet, wrapped his loose skin, and then he continued on. That night he was in so much pain that he just made a makeshift tent, curled up inside, and eventually was able to drift off to sleep. The next day, his feet hurt so badly he couldn't even walk. However, he couldn't afford to stay in one place for very long either. He was so close. So instead of walking, Douglas Mawson would drag himself for the remaining distance. At this rate, he could travel about 5 miles a day. Picture again with me. Mawson is dragging himself miles and miles on nothing but grit and the slightest glimmer of hope that this wouldn't be how his story ends. At this point, he was equally as concerned about crevasses opening up and swallowing him. But the struggle wasn't over, because this is exactly what would happen. A small crevasse would open up underneath Mawson and he would drop about 14 feet. Now, as I understand the sources, it seems that the width of the crevasse was thinner than the width of the sled. Since he was tethered to the sled and it got stuck in the crevasse, he dangled from the rope. And it would take almost all of his strength, but Mawson would pull himself up the rope into safety. He was so drained that he just set up camp right then and there for the entire night. Learning from his mistakes, Mawson would fashion together a ladder that, if he fell again, would make it easier to climb to safety. Ironically, the very next day, this happened. He'd fall again, but this time, the ladder actually saved his life. Mawson would spend a substantial amount of energy just dressing his wounds, but he would be able to manage to travel about 4 miles a day. But at this point, the weather started to turn rough again. He was about 40 miles from base camp at the time, and about 30 miles from a cave that contained supplies that he knew of. If he could just make it to the cave, he would have enough supplies to make it back to camp. However, he was in horrible condition. Even his hair began falling out. One great thing about Mawson, though, his navigation skills were remarkable. His return was mapped out exactly where he needed to go. He would discover a marker with a note and food that was left by his concerned companions back at his base camp. This gave him a surge of adrenaline and hope. It meant that they still had faith that he was alive. He would continue on to the cave where he would find oranges and pineapple. He began to cry because he was just so happy to see something that wasn't white. Finally, on February 8th, 1913, Mawson did the unimaginable. He reached base camp. However, the ship the Aurora had literally just left for Australia. The ship left behind a small party to wait for Mawson, but the ship itself was at a point of no return. This meant that Mawson had to spend yet another winter in Antarctica. But this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing because it would give him time to rest up, recover, spend some time with his companions and teammates. Now, it's been speculated that hypervitaminosis A was what claimed Mertz's life and almost Mawson's, though that isn't for certain. What's more important is that this story is one of pushing human limits beyond what should be possible. It shows us that we are all capable of more than we know, and that no matter how grim situations might seem, there is always hope. It may not seem like it at the time, but we are all capable of greatness. We just might not know it until it comes time to see our full potential. But I guess that's just another one of life's strange occurrences. Well, that will conclude our episode. We want to thank you all for tuning in and ask that if you liked what you heard, please like, comment, subscribe, and/or share. Unfortunately, I'm unable to do this full time, so be sure to click the little bell icon so that you can be notified of any future content and stay up to date with everything that's going on our channel. We are still growing and would love any and all support you can provide. If you have any suggestions for any stories that you'd like to hear, please leave those down in the comments below, and we'd be happy to take them into consideration. Again, thank you all for stopping by, and we'll see you again on the next episode of Life's Strange Occurrences.